Good evening and welcome to the world today. My guest with me in the studio is Ella Shohat, a very distinguished Arab Jewish scholar, and I stress both words, Arab Jewish, because the bulk of her writing, her essays, her books have worked on the theme of the links between these two communities, their affinities, the separations that took place, and why. We live in a world today where we are constantly taught that civilization in today's world is Christian Judaic civilization, the Christians and the Jews, which is an interesting tale and has been made up very recently. Ella teaches in New York, is professor of cultural studies and Middle Eastern studies at New York University. She has written a number of books, the latest of which is on the Arab Jew, Palestine and other displacements, published last year by Pluto Press. Ella, very happy to have you with us. Before we discuss the big issues, tell me a bit about yourself, your family, your parents, your grandparents, because you describe yourself very proudly as a Baghdadi Jew, a Jew whose origins lie in the ancient city of Baghdad. So when, as far as you know, sometimes histories go a long way back, when did your family settle there?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tariq, for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. My story actually is a story of the Jews of the Arab Muslim world who, as far as I know, in the case of my family, they were always there. So I would describe that community as part of that shall we say, Mesopotamian civilization, and part of the Iraqi Arab world. So in our case, you know, as my parents, my family, my community was displaced and dislocated and ended up in Israel.
Tell me, just before you carry on, what did your parents do? Where did your father work? What was his profession?
My father was an accountant. He worked in Iraq in the Baghdadi railway station, which was a governmental position. Yeah, exactly. And my mother was a housewife who had dreams actually to become a doctor, and that never materialized. And part of it was also this dislocation that took place and ended up affecting their lives in a very dramatic way, you know, where they lost everything and then arrived in Israel and lived in tents in horrible conditions. And I think the traumas that the community has undergone is something that everyone still lives with, the second and third generation. So yeah, at the same time, for my My father was very much Iraqi, so I grew up within an Iraqi culture.
And Arabic was the language?
And we spoke at home Arabic. My grandparents never learned Hebrew, so I ended up becoming their translators. And later on we moved to New York, and so for my parents it was a third country, third language. So it is only with partition of Palestine
in 1948.
In 1948 and the 47 and the establishment of Israel in 1948, that as Palestinians are violently and massively dislocated from Palestine and largely arrived to the Arab world, that we begin to experience a whole other reality. In the case of Iraqi Jews, in 50-51, most of the community is being dislocated largely to Israel. I won't get into the various narratives and conspiracy narratives about...
Well, because there are two narratives.
Yeah.
Both may be true. One is, of course, that the nationalist regimes, or even the pre-nationalist regimes, became quite hostile to the Jewish communities because of the implantation of the Zionist state in the heart of the Arab world. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they made life difficult. At the same time, the new Zionist state wanted to attract as many Jews as possible into the Israeli universe, and in order to do so, sometimes they did it with persuasion, offering money, but there are reports that in Baghdad particularly, Mossad participated in bombing Jewish cafes, pretending there was someone else was bombing them in order to get the people to move quickly.
Sure. I mean, I think all of those elements were at work, and I think we cannot, I mean, I'm not a historian who necessarily researched the case, but certainly this is also rumors were spreading within the community about those bombs and who planted the bombs. But certainly the situation was such that Arab regimes did not exactly also protected the Jews, shall we say. So there is a push and pull here that is taken place, which I discuss in my work, the various aspects that when we discuss the rupture of Jews from Arab countries, we must take into account. However, I'm very careful to suggest that we cannot exactly equate it with what happened to the Palestinians. This is highly problematic, and this is the reason why it was important for me to have the two aspects of the Arab Jew but also of Palestine, that the two perspectives here become important and they're not mutually exclusive. For example, Edward Said speaks in Orientalism on the way that with Zionism a split has taken place, a bifurcation between the image or the idea of the Arab and the idea of the Jew, with the Jew becoming going the Orientalist way and the Arab the Oriental way. In other words, the Arab remains the object of Orientalist perspectives and studies. So the question becomes, where does the Arab Jew fit? The Arab Jew, my argument, remains within the category of the Arab. That is, the Arab Jew remains within the Oriental paradigm. So my argument is that within Arab spaces, Jews were subjected to a process of double assimilation, double colonization. In other words, not only the general processes of colonization that the indigenous population underwent, but also one that was specifically targeted the local Jews by the Western, as it were, co-religionists who believed in the salvation narrative and the civilizing mission toward their own so-called brethren.
Let's just look at the situation of long before Zionism, let's say 40 years before Zionism, of the indigenous Jewish communities that lived in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and other regions of the broad Islamic world. In terms of assimilation, I don't mean intermarriage and all that. That happened, within a very limited number on both sides. But I mean in terms of rights, in terms of pogroms, there's no question, whichever way you look at it, Ella, that the pogroms carried out by the Orthodox Church in Russia, for instance, by the Catholic Church in Poland against the Jews, I mean by so-called Christian civilization or civilizations, were on a totally different scale to anything that may have happened and probably did happen to Jewish communities within the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. One of my critique first of the way Jewish history is conceived, talked, discussed is, first of all, that there is no Jewish history with uppercase H. There are Jewish histories in various parts of the world, Jewish cultures, and that particular experience of what is of Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, has been projected in a Eurocentric fashion over the rest of the world, especially within Muslim civilization. So I often critique the notion of the Judeo-Christian hyphen, saying that this emergence of the Judeo-Christian hyphen and the way it is narrated ends up also erasing the Judeo-Muslim hyphen, which actually historically was, for millennia, we have to speak about Jewish-Muslim civilizational sharing, dialogue, syncretism.
In the whole of Al-Andalus, in Portugal, in Sicily, they work together.
And in Baghdad and Cairo and Jerusalem. And so this notion, well, first of all, I would say Al-Andalus there were many Al-Andaluses in the rest of the Arab Muslim world. Coming back to your question, that in some ways I talk about the pogromization of Jewish history. And in other words, first of all, the word pogrom itself emerges of a particular linguistic, cultural experience of Eastern Europe, but that comes to, I said, the tracing of the dots from pogrom to pogrom throughout Jewish history. But in case of, this is not to idealize the situation of any community that, say, not part of the hegemony, but between that and suggesting that there was an endless persecution, not looking at the cultural autonomy, say, that Jews had, not looking into the cultural dialogue, the intellectual collaboration between Jews and Muslims, is to miss an important millennial history that, that one can look also into oppression. I think it's also important. But I think what has happened, there is a kind of retroactive reading of this history, especially of Jews within Islam, to fit particular contemporary Eurocentric paradigm, but also nationalist and colonialist ideas of the Jew who could never be an Arab, the Jew who was always the victim of Muslims.
And I was very struck many years ago, about 2 or 3 decades ago, I was making a film, in a number of films in India, and I went to the town of Cochin in Kerala. And they said, what would you like to see apart from the obvious things? And I said, does the synagogue in Cochin, is that part of the... They said, no, we wouldn't have taken you there, but if we will go. So we arrived at Jew Street, where the whole Jewish community lived. And I saw this amazing synagogue. I think it's a 16th century synagogue. And then, I started questioning the very dark-skinned Jewish caretaker of the synagogue, which was really lovely. And I said, how many people come here to pray? He said, very few, mainly very old people. All the young were taken to become soldiers in Israel. And then he showed me an album of photographs. And he said, what is interesting, if you look at these photographs, is there are 2 Jewish communities in Cochin. One is the very light-skinned one, and the other one is a dark-skinned one. And he said they never intermarried. And I was quite shocked, because I thought that the one thing within both Islam and Judaism was that, technically anyone Jew can marry another. I mean, the other thing the Cochin example showed is that many local people were converted to Judaism.
Sure.
So there's nonsense that, there's never any conversion.
I think it would be good for all of us to abandon notions of purity around origins, because I think that's really in some ways we're still haunted by certain 19th century biologistic tropes that still inform certain version of nationalism, even in sometimes progressive circles. And I think it's really crucial to understand as a premise that mixing took many forms, certainly mixing among population, whether conversion, intermarriage, including, of course, rape in history, and then cultural mixing. All of that suggests to us that neither in biological terms nor in cultural terms we can speak about any kind of pure identity. How racial categories are constructed and the idea of negativity associated with dark skin is something that one has to ask, and I think Black Athena, actually, Martin Bernal's book, is highly useful in this regard, to look, for example, into antiquity and see how the Aryanist narrative constructed Greece, as cleansed of its Semitic, Phoenician, African, Egyptian influences. And I think it's really important because it tells us that even the idea of blackness was not something that, say, in antiquity was perceived as something negative. So that I'm wondering to what extent the narrative that you were telling me right now about Cochin and the differences between the lighter skin and the darker skin Jews, to what extent that also informed by the circulation of racial categories of ideas and the kind of internalized notions of, the darker as the negative and the lighter skin as the positive, which has, by the way, also been part of the Arab world
yes, of course.
Itself in terms of various kind of color, hierarchy of color. I'll say another thing, that even within culturally, there is an important element to see that how Jews begin to travel within colonial context. So, for example, Baghdadi Jews ended up in Bombay and in Calcutta, where they actually continue to speak Arabic and identify with Baghdad as their cultural center, from which they brought their teachers and married also within the community.
What years were these?
We're talking 19th century with famous families such as the Sassoons. And so this is really moving to Hong Kong and Shanghai, etc. So this is not exactly the same way, say, that the dislocation took place after Zionism. And partition. This is a completely different ways of travel. It's migration, trade, exactly. So it's important for me always to come back to the idea of cultural syncretism, that no culture is static, no community is static. Every region undergoes transformation. So therefore, even when we speak about concepts of what is the Judeo-Christian, what is the Judeo-Muslim, we're only asking this question at this point of history precisely because there is a new kind of geopolitical affiliation in which Judaism is understood, especially since the post-Enlightenment era, and especially with the partition of Palestine, as affiliated with the West, something that was not true even in Orientalist discourse, that even the European Jew as Oriental, as we know. Hence the racialist categorization of the Jew as people of the Orient, even whether they were or were not from the so-called Orient.
And Ella, the difference between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazi, these differences have affected the functioning of Israel, where the Ashkenazi actually became extremely dominant and have been ruling with dire consequences today. I mean, even as we speak, Israeli courts are considering whether the deportation of Africans by the Israeli state is legal or not.
Right.
The Zionist project was a project of colonization. And many of the early Zionists, I mean, there were many who were cultural Zionists who said, we just want a cultural presence. There's a huge debates, as you know better than me. But once they decided on this project of Eretz Israel, a greater Israel, based on nothing more than biblical fantasies, and got the population to accept it, this has, in effect, been happening. I mean, if you look at the map of where Palestine was immediately after the formation of Israel and where it is now, it's just little dots of ink on the map, and in between deserts and Israeli soldiers, etc. I mean, when you think about this, do you ever think of how this can end?
Let me answer the beginning of your question first, which is the whole idea of, first of all, the Sephardi-Ashkenazi distinction. There are liturgical traditions, there are historical differences, but that difference was not grounded within racial colonial paradigms. And that's important to remember. Those were largely separate communities, not only geographically, culturally, liturgically, but that did not necessarily mean that they existed in relations of power. But something else happens with the emergence of colonial power. And that actually places now European Jews within the context of colonialism, with having more power over Sephardic Jews. That's one element. But with Zionism, it is really an idea of taking the notion of nationalism and taking the notion of Western civilization and seeing the idea of having a state there as part of that civilizing mission. There is something deeply paradoxical about people who were seen as Oriental within the context of Europe, but then seeing themselves liberated from that oppression by westernizing themselves, but in the context of the East. So the notion of Zionism is in itself embedded in those ideas of superiority and European superiority. That's very crucial to how they related to the land. They imagined the idea of a Western country, the Switzerland of the Middle East. The land is too dry, we have to make the desert bloom. Their conception even about the land of the mimicry of Europe that becomes so visually important to them. And then, of course, the idea of the Bedouins and the indigenous people as not counting, hence the idea of a land without people. It's not because I actually speak in my first book on Israeli cinema, I speak the fact that in the 30s, when they were filming early Zionist films, they had moments where they would say the land is empty, and then you see during location shooting Palestinians, peasants walking. It's not that the camera person and the director is not seeing on the screen as they're editing or filming, for that matter, but it is the very concept of an empty land is really a land of people without rights. So those people are part of the natural vegetation. They have the status of vegetation. They do not have the status of people. The other element, I nonetheless want to emphasize the anomalies, certain anomalies in that national colonial project, because Zionist discourse, in contrast to, while it was in terms of practices completely colonialist, in terms of its ideological formation also believed in a particular narrative of return, which was not usually true for most of the colonialist narratives, which were about newfound lands. Here, while they treated it as a part of a civilizing mission, they also created a narrative of origins and the notion that they are returning, hence the notion of tracing, as it were, the diaspora Jew back to that indigenous moment becomes so crucial, and fabulous work has been done in archaeology and biology, etc., looking into this highly problematic narrative that is being created.
Shlomo Sand, amongst others, has very effectively deconstructed
and Nadia Abul-Haj. So we have here work that actually suggests that, you know, the historical narrative is highly problematic. But I think nonetheless one has to take on board the question of return, because however, even if it's only borrowed by Zionists from a particular Jewish narrative about the exile, and nonetheless Zionism is using it. However, Zionism is using it differently than the traditional Judaic narrative, which is why for a long time, at least up to the post-World War II and the Holocaust, Zionism was such a minority movement, because most Jewish traditional leaders opposed Zionism because they saw it as antithetical to the notion of the messianic idea of return. And ultimately, I wouldn't have even trouble with the notion of return, however problematic it is, but it would have trouble is with this imaginary, exclusive imaginary, that now brings us back to the beginning of our conversation of the splitting of the Arab and the Jew. It is a Jew that is cleansed from its Oriental elements in anti-Semitic discourse, but it is also a Jew that cannot be an Arab, and hence the impact that it had later on the Arab Jews in terms of creating this almost schizophrenia in terms of our cultural experience. But it also completely impacted the definition of the region, because Palestinian Arabs could not live side by side anymore with that conception of Jewishness.
And in order to emphasize this, the Zionists did something which no one else has succeeded in doing, to my knowledge, ever, that they revived an ancient, antique language and made it the language of the state, Hebrew. Now, who could have dreamt that this would ever happen? I mean, the thought that the Indians could do it in relation to Sanskrit, no one even takes that seriously. But they did it partially for the reasons that you explained, to break completely from the dominant culture and language of that region, which of course is Arabic.
Sure, but I think it's one has to think about the fact that Hebrew was not necessarily always taken for granted as the language of national consciousness. At one point they even discussed German as a possibility of a German. Yeah, I mean, this is, we're talking about, after all, Germans was the language of Herzl. That's what he writes, The State of the Jews, and it is in Basel that the first Zionist Congress is taking place. So German also was seen as a superior language and culture. And this is, we're talking about early days of Zionism, right? In fact, they transformed Hebrew and Arabic as part of what is called Semitic linguistic family, are quite close to each other in terms of syntax, etc. But the modern Hebrew was all about rupture from the traditional Hebrew, and modernization of the Hebrew language meant that it, first of all, in terms of syntax, one, for example, begins with the pronoun, as in English, or and not with the verb, as you would do in Arabic and in Biblical Hebrew. In terms of accent, modern Hebrew is spoken in a way that, even though the traditional Hebrew has to be pronounced almost exactly like Arabic, most of the guttural sounds are eliminated. So the ayin, which exists in Hebrew and Arabic, becomes a becomes a, ka becomes ka, ta becomes ta. So, which is because they said these are vulgar sounds. So that was, in fact, it's so deep, this idea of modernization as westernization within Zionist discourse, that even the notion of the revival of an ancient language is not exactly about return. So there is an incredible paradox in this idea of return. While Palestinians were dispossessed, lost their lands, and have no access and cannot return, in the case of Arab Jews, we have been subjected to a completely different project. Because we were Jews, we were seen as part of that nationalist project, but because we're also culturally Arab, we had to undergo a violent process of de-Arabization. And that actually has been really a different kind of, I would call it, it's a form of epistemic cultural violence. That
cultural cleansing.
And cultural cleansing of everything, anything that is Arab about Arab Jews.
Ella Shohab, thank you very much for being here. It's been a really fascinating interview as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to have been here.